Okay, this is the first of the video blogs covering the course material. So I want to go through sort of an introduction. We already got, if you looked at the welcome, you understand the syllabus, where that's coming from, but I want to go in a little more detail, just exactly where world regional geography comes from, and also start on some of the terms which we're going to be going through for the next couple of video blogs. Try to keep each of these around 20 minutes, hopefully I will. So when you're looking at geography, geography is the study of people and the world around them, if you would, usually called people in the landscape. And geography has a chunk of sort of, not surprisingly, breaks itself up in different directions, usually tied around who you see as sort of the active agent. So for example, my specialty is cultural geography. That's part of human geography, which is, we teach the 103 class. So a cultural geographer looks at the idea of human groups, societies, cultures, and things like worldview, in terms that we'll see this semester. And we see that as sort of the main thing that we want to look at. So when we look at the landscape, for example, of this campus, the fact that this campus is built on a hillside, it was built here in 1927. The fact that a lot of what was sort of open area very recently was turned into parking areas for cars. All of this is part of the perception that we have in American society, one about the value of cars, the value of higher education, even location on campus on a hill, so it's visual, is part of the reflection of the logic and value system, and even sort of, if you would, perceptual imagery that we have in American society about things like school and higher education and how you do that and where it should be and what you should have. And in the 21st century, that includes accessibility, convenience, and a whole mess of other factors. And you see that then impacts the decisions. Decisions 10 or 15 years ago when they bulldozed this whole upper section of campus to put in parking, so students had more parking, was a logical choice given the American sort of attitude towards a bunch of stuff. But it also destroyed, a bunch of very minor Hawaiian planting areas, and then possibly, damaged potentially a religious site. We're not really too sure. So in that context, a bunch of choices were made. And most importantly, the landscape was radically modified. It would be impossible without a huge sum of money to turn this hillside back to what it looked like before it was bulldozed. So all of that is cultural geography, or part of human geography, where sort of people are the active agents, and the landscape is something that people shape, and then you can actually look at those shapes and get an idea of what the values of that group were. We'll see some of that, in this class, because obviously as we move from one spot to another, how people live and how they operate changes radically, and that gives you some insight into just exactly how they see the world around them. The other area of geography would be physical geography. And that would be basically where you see sort of the landscape as the active force. So for example, if you're involved in things like global warming, or say the plastic pollution here in the Pacific, on one hand, it's people generated, but you're looking at, in many cases, you're much more focused on the actual physical parameters, a sea level rise or temperature change, or climatic storm change patterns, or the North Pacific gyre, where all the plastic collects, ends up on places like Niihau. That would be much more from a physical standpoint. So it's still looking at people and land relationships, but it's more with looking at what the land part has, and people just become sort of the generator, if you would, or resultants of it. And that's sort of the two areas of geography, either the sort of more human or people as active agent space, where you're looking at the people part, or you're looking at the landscape part. Now, if you notice in that discussion, there's no place for regional geography. This type of geography, this particular class, is actually a reflection of European colonialism in starting in the 1700s. As the Europeans expanded, the Spanish, then the Portuguese, then later the French and the British and the Dutch and everyone else started expanding to the rest of the planet. And they ended up with the classic sort of paradox that people have ever since they started trading with their neighbors. Why are my neighbors different than me? And if I'm going to trade with them, what do I need to know about them so they don't whack me, for example, and I can do a good deal with them? So knowing people who are different than you, and knowing this in advance, so having some description before you went there, was really critical. And if you want to look at this, the earliest geographer of record, obviously there were ones before, but the earliest geographer of record would be Herodotus, the famous Greek geographer. And if you actually, and you can actually read his what are oftentimes called histories, but a lot of them are actually descriptions of all the places around Greece, whether it be Persia, whether it be the Scythians to the north, in areas which would now be Romania or Hungary. whether it be the folks to the west, the Celts, for example, in the north, whether it be the Etruscans in what's now Italy, and the Romans. What he did, a lot of his work was descriptive and talking about the areas around his part of Greece and what they did, what they ate, how they operated, what they thought about stuff. So that you were Greek and you wanted to make some money trading with these people, you wouldn't be going into it blind. So it was descriptive, but it was also incredibly functional. Now, in the Greek period, they tried an empire and they started to screw it up. Roman oftentimes called historians, but again, they're actually geographers, Strabo being a good example, did exactly the same thing. In the Roman Empire, since it was an empire, there were very functional reasons for that. If you're the Roman emperor, the Roman administration, and you suddenly, conquered England, Britannia, and you've now taken it over, you want all the description information you can get, not only of that place, but also the guys to the north, the Scots called the Picts at the times, the folks in places now called Ireland. You want to know about all those different Celts and the way that they operate and what they function, because you have political and military reasons why you're worried about them, or you want to control them, or you want to do deals with them. So what it was is geography is one of the oldest of the academic disciplines because it's so incredibly functionally useful. It's descriptions of other folks because you need to have that knowledge, or else you're going to end up with a really nasty surprise. You're going to lose money. So in some way, shape, or form, geography was always a powerful part of sort of what you might call geopolitics, or at least regional politics. This sort of fades out when the Roman Empire collapses because you really don't have empires. And in most cases, at least in Europe, you're basically whacking on your neighbors, who in many cases are exactly the same people as you. So it isn't until the Europeans start to sort of collate themselves into larger entities that you see sort of the resurgence again of geography. Now, ironically, what happens then is geography moves from Europe into basically, Turkey. It becomes part of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. And then from that morphs down into what would now be the Middle East, North Africa, with the Arabs as they move into it, especially as the Ottoman Seljuk Empire start up. They become the great geographers, Ibn al-Rashid, for example. So what you find is geography never disappears, but it's not that relevant unless you're really interested in your neighbors. Now, if you're the Vikings, you go up and beat up on your neighbors, but you don't need to know much about them because you're not going to do deals with them. Beat the crap out of them. So geography was when you had groups of people that wanted to know and needed to know about parts of the world that were outside of their normal experience. When the European empires start up in the 1600s, Columbus being the stereotype, you have this enormous new need for these new places. You have to remember by 1600s, Spain controlled a large chunk of the planet, including 2 whole continents. So they needed to have a huge amount of knowledge about what the Maya or the Azteca or the Incans were doing in parts of the Spanish Empire. One, because it wanted to make sure they could keep control of them, but 2, they also had to figure out how to manage this place. And you got to know what you got if you're going to manage it. And so what happens is geography then picks back up. But at this get-go, notice how it's still not an academic discipline. It's a functional discipline. It's part of what you would now call sort of political science. And more accurately, it's just part of political management. It's part of governance. And so what happens is geography sort of resurges itself and moves, largely from, if you would, the sort of Turkish Ottoman, West Asian area, moves back into the European empires. The European empires start to go into dominance. Now, by the 18th, 19th century, the European empires have gone crazy. By 1830, 1840, a large part of the world's surface was under control of the British or the French or the Spanish. And that meant a huge proportion, the majority, outside of China, the world's population was under control of one of those 3 powers. So if you're the British, by the 1850s, literally the sun never set on the British flag. Somewhere on planet Earth, the sun was shining on the British flag, even though it's a very small island itself. And so in this period, what you got was first the more aware of the reality of having to understand the folks around you because you're trying to manage them or trade with them or whatever. So as these colonial empires expand, the need for this type of knowledge in a very succinct, concise form grows. It's not by accident that encyclopedias started at this time too. What you also find then is by the let's say arbitrarily 1800, is the idea that you then actually train people in this versus them just sort of acquiring it on the job. So you actually start the idea of academic study, and people start to graduate from universities, in Europe and stuff like that, with these packages of knowledge. And not surprisingly, given these empires, one of the main areas that people would graduate in would be sort of a combination of what we now sort of call political management, geography, and maybe some history. And then you get shipped off to India or Singapore or Canada or someplace as part of that. So these were very much what I don't guess you'd call it, it'd be what you now think of like school of business. These were designed for the function of management of empire. And that's what the world regional geography class is. It's one of the last vestiges of the colonial system. Now, you might be thinking, well, I've got to take this thing. Why is it still around? Well, guess what? In the post-colonial system, you're no longer part of it. India is not part of the British Empire, but they still have enormously close social interactions. They do a lot of trade. Now, much of it in reverse. India is shipping to England instead of the other way around. Especially in the digital world that we live in, the world is a very, very small place. And so this knowledge of other places is even more pertinent because there's very little time lag involved. Now, if you think about it, if it's 1860 and I'm someone in San Francisco and I need to know what the Hawaiian monarchy is doing here, it's going to take 7 days to 10 days for a letter to get here to ask a question. It's going to take us 7-10 days for it to get back there. So if a large chunk of a month's going to be spent. Now, if I already know what's going on here, I already know who's here, I already know who the king is, I already know how the system works, then I can make a decision based on the knowledge I have. So there's all these time lags, but now that time lag is infinitesimal. If I want to irritate someone on the mainland, I can send off a text or a letter or whatever, and I'll get it, a second later, and then get all upset and fire me back an equally nasty response a second after that. We live in a world with instantaneous communication, and so the need for understanding others is even more critical than it was in the past because you don't have any chance to cool off. There's no chance to think, hey, wait, I shouldn't have said that, or did that guy really mean that? Because now it's literally, you can just, boom, off you go. You can be on TikTok and you just flame them out a second later. So the need to understand the world around us and how places and folks are different, and also how they're the same, is even more critical in this day and age than it was, say, 20, 40, or 100 years ago. And as one reason that I'm updating all these video blogs is simply because everything changes so much. The video blogs that I did for last year would not be, in some cases, relevant given the enormous changes that are occurring socio-politically in much of the world, especially in Europe and Asia in the last 12 months. So that's why this course is necessary. And this is why you should have this. And this is why in most of the world people take this course and they don't even think about it as a bad idea. It's just like a given because they're much more aware that they live in a very complex, diverse world, not in a simplistic world where everyone's like that. So if you notice, it gets back to the initial part of this, just the basic concepts, the physical part, the human part, the fact that the regional part is, if you would, the explicitly functional part of geography, but it's not actually part of the intellectual discipline, which falls into the first two areas.